Today, I'm honoured to welcome John Cornish. John is a fellow survivor of Bill Gothard's ATI program and for many years served as the public spokesperson for Recovering Grace, the website and community that became a lifeline for so many of us who were impacted by Gothard's teachings. Through Recovering Grace, John has helped to give voice to countless survivors, bringing hidden stories into the light. His own journey out of ATI and his work in this space has made him a trusted voice. John, thank you so much for being here. I'm really looking forward to hearing more about your story and your role in Recovering Grace.
Well, thank you for having me. This is a wonderful pleasure. We were talking offline. I feel like I've known you forever through online channels, but this is the first time I think we've ever actually had a chance to really talk face to face, even though it's across the ocean. So I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's really, and you think of all those messages that we've had going back and forth, and that
Yeah,
it takes time, about 10 or
yeah,
11 years ago. Yeah.
yeah.
So, just to start us off, tell us about Recovering Grace and how it began.
Yeah, so Recovering Grace was a website that launched in 2011. So I guess a little over 14 years ago now. Um, when we launched it, we really didn't know what we were getting into. We knew that we knew that Bill Gothard and IBLP were still going strong. They were still impacting lots of people. Um, and at the time, there was this growing online community, mostly through Facebook, that were of survivors that were connecting together and sharing stories. And Recovering Grace was largely born out of just kind of a desire in that group to do something to tell our stories, to push back. Our greatest concern was those that were still trapped in IBLP and ATI, and then those who might be exploring using the program with their own children. So I think it was early 2011, we kind of birthed the idea and just and being in the right place at the right time. There was a group of people who were like-minded in our endeavor, and we just kind of put out a call in those Facebook groups for volunteers to help us put it together. And in July 2011, we launched for the first time.
Mm. Um, so it really just basically grew from a social media group.
Yeah, that's entirely what it was. For me personally, I'd written a blog post on a WordPress blog. I guess it was late 2010, early 2011. It's still out there somewhere, and I just kind of wrote about my journey in ATI and some of the things I was discovering on I guess you would call it a deconstructing journey. That's the word everybody uses now. We didn't have a term for it way back in 2010. But I written a blog post about that, and through that I met some people who had emailed in, and this one person said, "Hey, there's a Facebook group called for ATI student survivors," and she invited me to join, and it was just in that group that I think for the first time there was a safe place. There had been other forums for former ATI people, but they weren't really open to discussing the problems with IBLP and ATI. But it was in that group that we were able to see that things that happened to one person happened to another person, that some of the struggles that we dealt with as adults coming out of the cult were in common. And it was just a place of kind of processing and for a lot of people healing, I think. And it was just through that process of healing that we wanted to do something to help the next generation.
So where did the name come from?
You know, the name was just a kind of a group brainstorm. I couldn't even tell you now who it was that thought up that idea. We were trying different things. The idea behind it, of course, grace was the theme. You know, that was the whole thing that Gothard twisted in his ecosystem was that grace was the desire and power to do God's will. And one could theologically certainly argue that's part of what grace does, that that's not ultimately what grace is. So we kind of liked the idea of recovering the definition of grace, or uh, recovering for us anyway. Most of the broader church would not have seen it his way in the first place. But we also liked the idea of grace for recovery. So it had kind of a double meaning, recovering the meaning of grace, but then also grace for recovering. So that's where the idea came from. Once we hit upon that, I think it locked in pretty quickly.
And did you just kind of see it grow and grow? Because by the time I discovered it, it was a well-run machine by the looks of it, which was
I guess it felt like it grew and grew, and we were probably actually, from a structural standpoint, we were at our largest in those early days. We had lots of people volunteering and doing different things. We had whole teams of people writing the articles or editing the articles, and then we had little team leaders that would take charge of different topics, and we had social media, and we had like a website team. So all these different people working together in different parts. And one of the things that we wanted to make sure that we did is we had plenty of content to go for a year or two. So we kind of started that way. Um, so yeah, we kind of had a system going, and it worked well for us in the time. And yeah, so I'm glad to hear that it looked that way. Sometimes it didn't feel that way on our end because things were crazy sometimes. But yeah.
yeah. I mean, you must have been it must have been amazing for all of you to see just the stories with the people just pouring out their stories and rolling in, really, weren't they?
Yeah, especially we had that core group, that was from that Facebook group at first, and we knew they had stories. But I think for me it was when the stories started coming in from the outside, people we had never heard of or people that we didn't know that were writing in to share their experiences, that really helped me see that, oh, we're actually making an impact here. People are reading this. And in a lot of ways, I think at first, Recovering Grace did a lot more. I guess the biggest impact was people processing their stories and starting their own deconstruction journeys and going to therapy for the first time. And I think it just kind of like helped us all realize, hey, we're still bearing the scars of our youth and our time there. Um, so yeah, it was an awesome time to be a part of. It was exciting. It was actually scary in a lot of ways too, because um, for a lot of people on the team, there was still family pressures. Families were connected to Gothard, or there's still. And I'm sure you can speak to this too. There's Gothard was held in such high regard that to go publicly and speak out against him felt terrifying at first in some ways. So yeah, the first year or two was just it was busy, and it was exciting. It was sad as stories came in. I know we'll talk more about that later, um, but yeah, it was a crazy time.
I've often thought, like, I know Bill used to talk a lot about how the seminar ministry grew through word of mouth. Like, he never advertised. That was kind of a thing that he emphasized, that he never had to advertise, because the seminar ministry grew through other people talking about it. And I feel like it's been a little bit like that with Recovering Grace too. Like, I heard about it from a friend. Um,
Hmm.
I thought that was kind of cool, actually.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that reminds me, there was one day, it was probably 2011, 2012, when I got a phone call from an old friend from ATI days who I hadn't spoken to in probably 10 years at that point. And he calls me and he said, hey, John, I just wanted to share with you this website that I discovered called Recovering Grace. And he was calling to tell me about it. And I was like, well, I'm on the team that's running it. So, um, and then, I just heard from people over the years, the different ways they heard about it from friends. And, we did a lot of social media. We did a lot back then. We still can do paid Facebook advertising. It was a lot more effective and a lot less annoying than it is now. We did some of that back then to get things seen. We did some billboards. The most famous one we did was just a Recovering Grace billboard down the street from the Nashville Training Center the week of their conference, which we never knew if anybody saw that until Ginger Duggar wrote about it in her book. So I was like, oh, they did see it. So, um, um, but
I
yeah.
remember all the conversations around that when you did that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, in your view, what impact has Recovering Grace had on the broader and the wider ATI and IBLP community? And
I think it's of course it's a broad question because everybody's going to have different answers to it depending on how you viewed what we were doing, how much you believed of some of the things that came out, and um, I, what I think the general um, byproduct of Recovering Grace is that it started a conversation for a lot of people. And I say conversation both like internally, like a processing. Um, it started some conversations in families. Like I heard stories of people who sat down with their parents and for the first time and explained to them just how being raised in ATI impacted them, and it ended up being a healing process. On the flip side, there are families that probably it I say tore apart. It exposed what was already there. Parents who weren't responsive to their children's concerns about it. Um, of course, we can't talk about Recovering Grace without talking about, the valiant work you and others did in sharing their stories about some of the harassment and the mistreatment of Gothard by young women, which ultimately led to his resignation and I guess you can call it a banishment from IBLP. So that I think that's definitely a lasting impact. Um, I think. I think what satisfies me sometimes is that anytime you hear Bill Gothard's name mentioned now on a podcast or in a magazine or in a book, it's in a negative connotation, and it talks about a lot of the things that we got to expose for the first time. So I think I think just shining light. That was one of our big goals in the beginning, was just shining light on it, and I think the light got to shine, and he's never going to be able to rewrite that story.
yeah, it's huge, huge impact. Mm. Um, did you notice any kind of patterns in any of the survivors? Like, I know you would have seen so many stories coming across um, from some of the survivors that were in the program. Like, did you start to notice any kind of patterns in their recovery and in the way that they were working through some of their trauma?
Yeah, I did. I think a lot of frankly, a lot of the patterns I saw, it kind of depended on how involved the individuals were and the families were within like culture and churches outside of IBLP. So a lot of times in ATI, you'd have families that like their church was an ATI church. Every family in that church was a Gothard church, and there were no friends outside of the ATI world. Um, so they had one process of like deconstructing because like their entire childhood world, they had no frame of reference for what normal religion, what normal life, normal culture should be. And then you had those whose, you know, their parents just kind of dabbled in Gothardism. Like they may have used the curriculum, but they used other curriculums and they just kind of had a toe in the water of the deeper stuff. So I think their journey was different too. I would say mine's was kind of there. My dad was a Southern Baptist minister, so I was in a church that actually was not very Gothard friendly, strangely enough. So I had some points of reference. I still had a lot of mental and psychological work to do in adulthood, kind of disentangling a lot of things. Um, but so I think the what happened in those formative years really affected the patterns of behavior coming out. So what I guess I would say my analysis is, and I've not done like studies or deep, psychological research here. I'd say if you were really, really deep in and like your entire world was Gothard, it's been really hard to recover from that. And that's, we'll see people, who've struggled with addictions, and self-harming behaviors. Not all, but I think they're more prone to that. Whereas those who were kind of like had feet in different worlds, their work has been more about dealing with the shame side and the mental processes side and trying to figure out, is there a God? If so, who is he? Am I a good person? Untangling all of those things. So I don't think there's been one path for any person, but that's just the big pattern I see. That the further in you were as a child, the harder the work has been coming out, and those that had some grasp on the real world have had a little bit easier journey doing so.
Yeah, because those early childhood years are so formative, aren't they? And uh,
Hmm.
very hard to break out of those patterns. You know,
Absolutely.
yeah. Yeah, it's interesting how the damage is just goes so deep and is so widespread and
Hmm.
a
Yeah.
lifetime. It's really a lifetime of recovery, I think.
Oh, absolutely. And one thing I've noticed too, like I have two teenagers, so they are now at the ages where I was most formed by ATI and of course, it's one thing to just look at them and real you see how young they seem, and it's like, what were my parents thinking? Well, you know, my daughter goes off to high school every day and does marching band and all of her classes, and at that age, I was up in a training center, being indoctrinated, and it's like it's so that's the reprocessing there, and then just as your children get older too, and you process different stages, you're like, okay, how do I parent here? Because my only frame of reference is the Gothard way, and how do I not overcorrect and then just not discipline at all because I want to be all grace and so I think at every stage of life until the grave, we're going to be wrestling with some aspect of it that comes back, whether it's just a random thought or a random teaching or a random Bible verse you hear in church, and you're like, oh, I remember that one. And what does that actually mean? And it's just, I don't know. I think I've come to peace with the fact that it's never going to be complete healing, but for me personally, my hope is in a restored world. So, um,
Yeah. Celebrate those little moments with your kids too, like, don't you?
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
moments of
And I'll
triumph.
say, yeah. And I will say what, of all, Shiny Happy People, when it came out a couple of years ago, the Amazon documentary, I think the biggest blessing for me in that was I was able to sit down and show my kids and say, all right, this explains a lot right here. This is the way I was raised, and they asked so many questions, and it enabled us to have so many um, just deep discussions of life, and help them understand the mistakes I'd made at times and things I was trying to do. Um, but yeah, those moments,
Yeah,
it was a moment of celebration, I guess, like you said.
yeah. And it validates a lot of your experience. And you're right. I mean, it was the same for my kids as well, showing them
Yeah.
this is what it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know you probably can't get into any sort of personal stories, but in the years that you worked with Recovering Grace and getting all of those stories out, were there any that sort of stayed with you, like any that really kind of um, you think about a lot, impacted on
Yeah, yeah, and I don't want to, yeah, like you said, I don't want to go into personal details, but I, I think I'll frame this in categories. There were two categories of stories that have stuck with me, and yeah, there are some specific ones that come to mind even now. Um, for me, when I started Recovering Grace, my frame of reference was mostly my story, and a lot of the damage for me was just up in here. It was how I viewed the world and trying to disentangle all of that. And looking back now, I realize how fortunate I was to just have that damage. So for me, there were two categories of stories. One, just people writing in with stories of just horrendous child abuse in their homes under the name of of the system and in the name of God, frankly, it's how it was administered to them. And you know, fortunately, I never experienced that in my home. So just reading some of those stories were just eye-opening would be putting it positively. It was jarring. I just realized how much harm had been done. Not necessarily because of Gothard, but using his system as justification for it. I know there's child abuse of all kinds outside of Gothardism, but it was just this specifically insidious kind where children were abused and God was blamed for it by their parents, or justified for it. So that category of story still to this day sticks with me. And then second would be the stories of the young women who were sexually harassed by Bill Gothard, yours included. Before starting Recovering Grace, there'd always been the rumors of the way that Gothard had favorites and all that. And I remember hearing that back when I was 15, 16 years old. It was this kind of a ha ha ha, Uncle Bill has his favorites kind of thing. But it was the first time I read the story that we published as Lizzie's story. I just read that and I had to just stop. I was like, I did not realize how diabolical and manipulative he was of situations to get specific girls to headquarters. You know, I guess my assumption had been that it just, once you got there, he would kind of, have favorites. Not that he would move heaven and earth and call your parents and manipulate and do everything possible to get you into get you into his presence. So reading those, and of course there were so many of those, some of which were unpublished. Just people want to write in and say, "Hey, I validate this happened to me too. I'm not willing to go public with it." That kind of story sticks with you, and I mean, it kind of feels in the last 15 years with Me Too and Church Too movements and all of that, that we kind of get numb to it, that abuse and manipulation happens in these large religious ministries. But at the time for me, it was pretty shocking, and and saddening, and I mean, and enraging in a way, at the time, and which is what led us to do the things that we did and making those public. So.
Yeah, and it were those stories that kind of led to his resignation too, in many ways, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, 100%. Yeah, because he resigned, more or less. I think his plan was to resign and then come back in a few weeks or a few months, let things cool down or whatever. I think he thought he could fix it all, cover it all up, and but I mean, the the part of the Recovering Grace story that not everybody knows is that not only were we going public with things, but we were having lots of conversations with IBLP leadership behind the scenes too, and and they were talking to some of these women, and they knew some of these women, and there were a lot of influential leaders, training center leaders, ATI directors, who knew this was all true. So once Bill stepped away, they had a way to set him aside. I wish in some ways they had set him aside even more and been more honest. But they, you know, but yeah, it did eventually lead to him basically being sidelined, and he's, to this day, he's still on the sideline. So.
Lasted longer than 17 days, so the first resignation.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. So how did you, because you were quite a public spokesperson during that time, even
yeah,
CNN, I remember that.
yeah, yeah. That was a wild day for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So how did you become the spokesperson, and what was that like for you?
It was I guess it was kind of an accident. There was, I mean, obviously when we launched, there was never really an idea that we would need a public spokesperson. The idea is that we would be anonymous for the most part. Again, and a lot of that reason was not that we were ashamed of anything we were doing. It's just that we had family members and yeah, there was some anxiety around it with, people who still had connections to Bill and whatnot. Um, so really what happened is when it started because Bill reached out to us initially and wanted to have a conversation with us, and we kind of talked as a leadership team. We're like, okay, who wants to be the one to talk to him? And I guess I'm not gonna say it was the short straw, but essentially where I was in my career at that point, I didn't have anything to lose. My family had kind of walked away from Gothardism 10 years prior. My career was not dependent on Bill's opinion of me or anything he could do. So at the time, I just kind of became the one. So once he knew my name, I was the public one, and it was safe for me to be public. My good friend Carrie Underwood, not the country singer, but Carrie, she was also willing to speak publicly about it as well. So that's kind of how that happened. And then just over time, there was some news articles that came out just about there was a murder case in Connecticut where the murder was committed by a former ATI student, and they found recovering grace, and they asked to interview, and I talked to them, and my name was public there. So just as things kind of progressed, when there were interviews, it was either going to be me or Carrie. And then it just so happened with the CNN thing that was all surrounding Josh Duggar, and his scandals. They reached out to us, and next, I did a couple of newspaper articles that week, and next thing I know, CNN was calling, and 5 hours later, I was on live TV. So, um, I'm they were I guess interesting experiences is how I would frame it. But not something I ever thought would happen or intended to happen. It's just how things unfolded.
So I know with Gothard's misconduct, the Recovering Grace team were a big part of mediation or discussions around that at the time. How do you see accountability for him in ATI and IBLP? Um, like I know it wasn't adequate at the time.
Absolutely not. Yeah, unfortunately, in this world, there's often times when justice is not fully served, and things like statute of limitations and just the hurdles of the legal system and things um, make it almost impossible in many cases for justice to be done, especially as we would like to see it. Um, I do take solace in the thought that, since Recovering Grace started, he went from being the head of a multi-million dollar, corporation masquerading as a ministry. And now he's a 90-year-old man sitting alone with very few friends and supporters. So I think, you know, for any person with the level of ego and narcissism that he had, I can't really think of a better punishment than to be alone and unadored. So I think there is some justice there. As far as IBLP goes, you know, they're still sitting on piles of cash and properties and things, and they'll continue to sputter along for probably decades. You know, honestly, I've seen a few positive signs here and there in some of their materials, but largely they're just a tiny little ministry now that's not really doing a whole lot. So I guess in a way they've had some justice as well. Um, my observation is that those who are still working for IBLP were trying to do what was right in this scenario. I don't know that they did the right thing, but they were, as best they could, they were trying to redeem something out of it. I guess in my mind, a perfect solution would have been that they had liquidated and created a survivors fund or did something to help support all those they had damaged. But ultimately, if your understanding of theology and of who God is and what He expects doesn't change, you're not going to see some of these things as issues that need to be addressed, if you don't believe grace is grace, um, why would you put money helping people understand it as such? So, yeah.
That's a good point, actually. I know I know for the girls that were involved, like myself and the others that were involved,
Hmm.
um, and also Recovering Grace, a lot of the accusations that were heading our way from the supporters of Bill Gothard and IBLP were that we were doing this to bring it down and
Hmm.
destroy it. But actually, that is not the truth of it at all, is it? It was just a place for people to come and
Yeah, and that's the thing is I wish I could show people like the emails I saw and the things that I knew at the time because like again that's their defense that it's all some conspiracy that you guys all got together and plotted it, but I'm like no, I saw the first email come in and then I saw other emails come in and most of y'all didn't even know each other. And these stories came in as individual stories from each of you and the similarities and the patterns were all the same. But there was no way you could have coordinated it because you had never met. And you were different time periods. You were decades ahead of the youngest ones that wrote stories. Yet the facts of the story are almost identical. And many of these stories started coming in even before we published anything. So it was, there's just no way it's possible that you guys got together and plotted this whole thing.
yeah. I mean, and the same for Recovering Grace. It's not like you did this to destroy Bill Gothard and destroy IBLP. You did it because
Yeah.
you needed a place to talk, right? And deconstruct and
100%. Yeah. Yeah, we had no idea. I could never have predicted that what happened what was going to happen. We just wanted to shine light, deconstruct, tell stories, process, heal, hopefully, warn others. That was a part of our mission as well, was to warn others, but you know, there was we couldn't have planned what happened.
no, no, couldn't. So what do you think that the the survivors of ATI, what do you think they most need now, 10 years, well, more than 10 years, isn't it, since Recovering Grace?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been 15 since well, 14 since we started, and then I think Gothard's resignation was 2014, 2015, somewhere in there, and then and yeah, so um, it's interesting. I think there are people who are still just now waking up and realizing the damage that was caused, because there were in 2011 there were still children and teenagers that were fully in the program, so they're just now reaching the age that I was when Recovering Grace launched. And so they're, they need people like you and the others who are out there using, different channels, using TikTok and Instagram and Facebook and writing books and publishing things. They need people like that to carry the torch of what we started and help them do the same thing that we did, and process all of that. So that's a big thing they need. Those of us that are further on down the journey, I think it's gonna be different for each person. I know a lot of people who are raised in IBLP and ATI. They've kind of walked away from any Christianity whatsoever, and I 100% understand why someone would do that and and end up there. And no judgment at all for that. For me, I'm a pastor in a Methodist church, and I still believe in God. And from that perspective, I hope that everyone that was damaged can find the real Jesus and find the real truth of a Savior who is gentle and lowly and who loves and who gives grace and doesn't expect us to work and work and work and work and change the world, but expects us to just embrace Him. So that's my prayer for a lot of the survivors as well. But I think it's just at the end of the day, people need healthy spaces to process. They need people to understand them. They need relationships. They need their families, and that's where I hope we're at 15 years later.
Yeah. And it takes time too, doesn't it, to
100%. Yeah.
realize that you were lied to about a lot of things, and then where do
Hmm.
you go?
Uh-huh.
It's quite a journey back to that. So
Yeah.
if you don't mind, I know you've written very thoughtfully about your own journey for recovering grace, and one of those pieces you mentioned, obsessive compulsive disorder, was something that you struggled with, and that it was connected in many ways to Gothard's teachings.
Hmm.
Would you feel comfortable sharing a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think I still, and in a lot of ways, I've healed from that, and but yeah, it still shows up from time to time. So I'll be clear. I was never officially diagnosed with it in any form, but it was just kind of my way of looking back at a certain stage of my life and seeing behaviors and going, okay, that makes sense. That's what they would probably call that if I went and asked someone to diagnose that. Um, I've read a little bit about, spiritual obsessive compulsive disorder, and I guess that's what you might call it. And it was the behaviors were things like, locking doors repeatedly. And for me on the spiritual side, like I would, uh, I remember as a teenager, like trying to do prayer before a meal, on my own, and then like repeating the prayer like 50, 100 times because I wasn't sure I had done it just right. So it kind of had that manifestation of obsessive compulsive behavior, but the motivation was fear of displeasing God. That God would, if I didn't pray just right, that God would judge me. And so that's what I mean where it comes from, like Gothard's teaching, is because God was never presented as a loving God. It was presented as someone that we have to please and appease, or at best a systematic God who always works the same way in every circumstance, and what you sow, you reap, and whatnot. And of course, just the culture of judgment at the training centers too. So there's just this mindset of be perfect, be perfect, be perfect, be perfect. So that manifested itself for me in kind of that, obsessive compulsive. As I initially made my way out of Gothardism, it was kind of just coming to an awakening and a realization that God accepts me and loves me no matter what I do. Um, and having that kind of cognitive knowledge enabled me to kind of go, okay, I'm just going to ignore that crazy voice that has me do things over and over again. And that helped initially. I think years later now, where I see it pop up is just in kind of a tendency to try to control things in my life, fear of making mistakes and being judged or misjudged or being perceived as bad or sinful. So maybe it's not so much obsessive compulsive now as it is just like trying to carefully craft a safe world to live in. And that's just something as I get older, and I've been in and out of, I'll be honest, I've been in and out of therapy for 2 decades, dealing with different things and different life crises that kick up a whole new set of stuff. Um, and just over time, I guess the voices get quieter, and the voices of truth get louder. But as we said earlier, it's gonna follow us to our grave to some extent, I think.
I just thought it was a really interesting, like it was such a vulnerable thing for you to write about, and connecting it back to Gothard was really fascinating, just because his teachings are so fear based, and it almost like ATI was this utopia that he tried to create, where we could all live in this perfect world and have nothing go wrong, and how that reflects back on him and his needs, I guess. Like
Yeah.
he, even with,
Yeah, and
sorry,
yeah, no, it's okay. Yeah, and I try to put myself sometimes, maybe not so much in his shoes, but in my parents' shoes, or the other parents and the leaders, and realizing that their childhoods were formed by the trials and turmoils of the 60s and the 70s, and there were a lot of things that went on there too that were scary for parents. And, there's of course the satanic panic of the 80s, late 70s, early 80s that impacted a lot of parents. So I can see now why they wanted to create this framework and this structure, and because there was so much chaos. And so the idea of a system that could produce repeatable results was very appealing. So I understand why that, but I think they missed the whole point, is that like the problem with evil and sin is it's not all out there. It's in our hearts, and it's within us sometimes. And so to try to control children by systematizing everything in their life is just not going to work. It's like the movie The Village. I think that's like the perfect picture of it, because in the Village, try not to spoil it for those who haven't seen it, but the idea is that these people from the 60s and 70s tried to create this utopian, puritanical village where everything was controlled, and ultimately bad things happen because the bad's not necessarily out there. It's just part of human nature. So yeah.
Yeah, I wonder sometimes with the Gothard's own need for control and his own need to do the right thing is actually what created the cult. Um, he was quite controlling, with he couldn't, like the training centers. When I was working for him, the tiniest little minuscule thing that went wrong, it had to come always back to Gothard. It always had to come back to him. He was the one that had to solve that problem. It was just, he had his fingers in every pie, and he wanted to know all the details of everything. Um, I just linking that with that fear-based teaching is quite fascinating.
Yeah, I've heard bits and pieces, about his family of origin and things, and I do think there is some truth there. There was a lot of toxicity and dysfunction, particularly from his dad, and I think, I don't think it justifies anything, just like my choices as a parent don't, and as an adult, I can't blame my parents for everything. But I think his response to some of the emotional abuse, I guess one could call it, in his family, was to try to create his own world where he was adored. It's the classic narcissistic development, is to surround yourself in a world where you're the king of the universe, and that's a method of coping, I guess. And yeah.
Yeah, yeah. It's I think for myself, getting away from that fear-based um, religion, or that all the rules. There were just so many rules in ATI, weren't there?
Hmm.
More you can't do than you can do. Uh,
Yeah. Well, and then just, I mean, there's so many rabbit trails we could go down here, but
yeah.
this hyper focus on all the Levitical laws and the Old Testament laws, which, you know, if you believe that Christ came to usher a new kingdom, they don't even apply to us anymore. But then, not to mention that the number one command in all of Scripture is to fear not, and and the whole culture was fear. And there was no peace. There was no, joy. There was no the fruit of the spirit. As much as they talked about it, you just didn't see it. Or if you saw it, it was this performative, bright eyes smile that just a put on. It's a performance. It was a walking performance that everybody put on to look a certain way. So yeah.
Yeah. So just to finish up our conversation,
Yeah.
what plans, or are there any plans for Recovering Grace going forward? Um, what's happening?
Yeah. We've talked about it as leadership. At once, I'd say roughly 2016, 2017. There was the time where, one, we were all exhausted, because we'd put in 5, 6 years And there were some long days, some long weeks, some long late night calls trying to figure out how to handle certain things. And you know, by 2016, 2017, one, we were tired. Two, there was just a time when there was some job moves, all positive things for people that were on the leadership team. Just life transitions, and so that's when we kind of went on hiatus there first, and we've all stayed in touch over the years. And you know, when Happy People came out a couple of years ago, there were some conversations and even some initial steps taken to maybe seeing if there was a role for us going forward. But I think we just kind of all realized that, you know, we've passed the baton. You know, there's new voices out there who are articulating clearly the problems with Gothardism. You know, um, people are sharing their stories in new ways and new platforms, and you know, I think for a lot of us, we after you know putting us go after basically re-immersing ourselves in Gothardism for 7 or 8 years, we kind of reached a point where, like, you know, we don't want our entire lives to be defined by Gothard. So I think you know, just different ways. We all took different paths and are finding different passions and different meanings. There are some who are still doing good work in the cult survivor world, and you know, one of our team members is now a licensed professional counselor, or about to be, and you know, has taken the work that we did onto a new ministry, and you know, it's exciting to see where everybody has kind of ended up. But you know, as far as Recovering Grace having an active presence in the future, I'm not gonna say it never would happen, but currently there aren't any active plans. But you know, I think all of us, you know, are happy, or satisfied, I guess, to see that the message is still being spoken. That anytime you hear Gothard's name mentioned on a podcast or a documentary or a news report or a TV show, it's a realistic picture of who he was and who IBLP was.
I mean, you'll still keep the website up there because it's such a incredible resource. Um,
Yeah, yeah. At this point, there's no plans to take it down. I mean, it is, you know, anyone that looks at it now, obviously it's aged a bit. There's not really anyone that is actively keeping it modernized and updated, but we're not. We want to keep that archive up there, one way or another, keeping that information, those stories out there, and people still come across it. We still get emails sometimes, and it's a good resource. So there's no plans for it to come down or anything like that. But as far as an active, new, intentional work, I don't see that in the near future, at least.
I mean, I still use it. I still point people that way just because it's got so much information there and the history.
Yeah,
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 yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's a wonderful resource to have. But and I just want to say thank you to you
mm,
and the Recovering Grace admin team as well. That I know you put so many hours in um, effort into it, and especially those years that were really intense and it changed my life, and I know it changed the life of a lot of other people as well. Just having that a place you knew other people were experiencing similar things and uh,
yeah. Yeah. Well, you're very welcome. It's still to this day. I mean, I don't know what my life has ahead of me, but I think I'll always look back at it as just one of the proudest things I was ever got to be a part of was that team, and just that moment, and hearing, you know, even from you, you know, I know you've done a lot to impact others as well, and but just to hear how we impacted you is just it's very gratifying. So thank you.
and thank you so much for your time today and sharing all of that with us. I'm really grateful to you for coming and speaking with us about that. So thank you.
Absolutely. You're very welcome.